Greetings, you curiouser and right now anxiouser Herle Burly-ites. We're following up last week's pod with Andrew Coyne with another nerve-jangling conversation about the 24/7 norm-wrecking of Donald J. Trump. This one leaning into how he's shifting global relationships and alliances here in Canada and across Europe, resulting in, maybe just a whole new world order. That's all. Three-time Herle Burly guest, the brilliant Jennifer Welsh, is here to talk about that. Jennifer's episodes are always amongst our most listened to, and I'm thrilled that she's back. She hails from Regina like me, but our CVs take very different paths from there. Jennifer is a Rhodes Scholar, earning her Master and Doctorate in International Relations at Oxford. She co-founded the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict, served as Professor and Chair of International Relations at the European University Institute in Florence. She was Special Advisor to Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, on the responsibility to protect. She's been the Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security at McGill University and is currently the Director at the Max Bell Institute for Public Policy at McGill University. Jennifer, it is fantastic to welcome you back to the Herle Burly.
Good to see you again.
Hey, listen, we haven't talked in a while. How are you?
I'm good. I'm well. I've taken on this new challenge at the Max Bell School at a time which is pretty turbulent. And so it's hard to keep up with what we're teaching our students and how we're thinking about preparing them for this new world that you're describing. But I also had a sabbatical in the fall, so I did a bit of traveling, gave me a sense of how the world was preparing for Trump, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Hey, Montreal had a tough winter. Are you through it yet?
We are. There is so much snow. I mean, you and I grew up with snow, but ever since moving here, I realize what it is to get rid of volumes of snow. But yeah. I've loved it. I've actually really loved it. It's been a great winter to get out in mostly, yeah.
Montreal does get a lot of snow, but you wouldn't have wanted to be back in Saskatchewan because the temperatures there at points were absolutely ridiculous. You know, they've come up with a new term, life-threatening. They never said that when we lived there. They just told us how many seconds you could be outside before your flesh would freeze.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So you knew exactly how quickly you had to get to the car or from the bus to the school or whatever. Now they've got now they call it life-threatening, which it always was.
Yeah, I guess when we were sent outside to play or whatever, it might have been semi-life-threatening. But no, you're right, minus 45. Yeah, talking with my family, minus 45, minus 50, just crazy.
Yeah, unbelievable. Listen, what a time to be alive. I mean, I am seeing things I never thought I would see in my life. America first, America only. The U.S. completely walking away from its role as the focal point of advocacy for democracy, Western values, and institutions. The U.S. allied with Russia against Europe, NATO's existence being in peril, the U.S. canceling its foreign aid programs, the U.S. demonstrating most directly with Canada and Ukraine that relationships are now completely transactional based on short-term benefit. I'm feeling completely at sea. How about yourself?
Yeah, it's deeply unsettling. It's deeply worrying. I find it is extremely hard to keep up with the pace of what is happening and to have time to digest what it can mean. But like you, I find myself having to check my assumptions that, we all have based on when we grew up and what we experienced. Timothy Garton-Ash, the British writer, refers to people as 1945ers or 1968ers, right? And I'm a 1989er. That was the formative period in my life. And so I came of age when global order was on the upswing. Yeah. And so it takes time to digest what it means, to be reminded that history is not about linear progress, that it is, about moves forward, moves backwards, that we are naive if we believe that conflict has been transcended, and that we now need to really dig in and think in a very strategic way, but that's hard with the U.S. president, but in a strategic way about how we want to navigate through this.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to strategy in a second because I don't know how you develop a strategy when you don't know what the rules of the game are or how you win it. But I wanted to start with this. I hope I'm not putting you on the spot. Back in 2004, a little bit more than 20 years ago, you wrote a book, great book, called At Home in the World, A Global Vision for Canada. How would you have to revise that book today?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot, actually. Well, I think one part of it would require not so much a complete overhaul, but a reminder, because that book was written in the post-2001 period when, you and I remember this. There was another debate about our relationship with the United States, right? There was a belief in some quarters that after 9/11, with the possibility that our border would be shut due to their security concerns, we had to go all in with the US and create a much deeper economic partnership, economic and security partnership. People were talking about an economic union, a grand bargain with the United States. And so in some ways, it's a similar moment, but I think it's much more profound because at that time we were still dealing with a country that saw itself as our ally and was predominantly concerned about its own security. Now it is much broader than that. Now it is about the U.S. believing that it must become the place for all investment, for all economic growth, much more protectionist. So definitely that would need revision. I think as well, the rather optimistic view I had of Canada's capacity to, punch above its weight, to still have impact in terms of a vision for its foreign policy, being a model citizen. I talked about Canada being a model citizen in the world. And I think that part would need quite a lot of revision, partly because of what's happened in Canada, but partly because of what's happened in the West in general, right? That, remember that this was a period, and you mentioned foreign aid and international development assistance, when Western countries still saw their role as assisting other societies, less developed societies, post-conflict societies, to come out of their period of instability, build institutions, try to stabilize, and that we had something to tell them about how that could be done, right? That we had models that were relevant. I don't think that's completely untrue, but I believe the credibility of that message now has been absolutely eroded, right? That given how Western countries are perceived to have talked, but not walked that talk with respect to values and rules and norms, means that in places in the world where we used to engage, somewhat asymmetrically, we have the answers for you. There just isn't a receptivity to that. There are charges of hypocrisy. There are, who are you to talk to us about democratic institutions? It's a very different playing field. So a lot would need to be revised. And I think finally, David, there's a sense in which we are much more aware now. Canadians are becoming much more aware about how the international system is real today. If we can call it a system, we could talk about whether it's an order, but it's a system at least, right? Whether it is even hospitable to some of our values any longer, right? It was for such a long time. We benefited, one might say, disproportionately from the post-1945 order. And it was very hospitable to the things that we prioritized: free trade, rule of law, all of those things. And I think in the period, the 20 years since I've written that book, that's become less true.
I speculated about a new world order for a couple of reasons, one of which is that I hear people talking about the U.S. seeing the world now in terms of spheres of influence. and China will have a sphere of influence, and maybe Russia has a sphere of influence, and the United States will have a sphere of influence, and Canada seems like some sort of sub-state in that even if we don't get absorbed, we're not really a full player in that world. And the things I hear coming out of Europe, where European leaders seem to be really at the forefront of talking about, okay, everything's changed, right? And we have to Europe has to stand up for itself and develop its own capacity. And maybe we're not allied with the United States anymore. So that all feels like a new world order to me. Is it?
Yes, I think this is a really big pivot. Of all the things that have happened in the last, let's say, 2 weeks, I think that speech by the new German chancellor was very striking in saying, coming out even before he had formed his government, to say, and there's been some discussion about whether the translation from German into English was exactly right, but the word in the translation was indifferent. Right? The United States is now indifferent to us. At best, it's indifferent. At worst, it may even be an adversary, although he did not say that. He said it is indifferent to Europe, to European security. We will have to build our own system of securing ourselves on the continent. That was a very big statement, in my view. And being one of the first to say, other than the murmurings of Trump and others, that NATO itself may need to be rethought. Because, of course, NATO is the institution that connects North America to Europe. And it is, as you may have heard said many times, it's based on a treaty, but it also has a huge psychological element to it, that it rests on the credibility of the promises in that treaty. And so if we think through his statement and we think through the possibility that NATO itself may be evolving, that would be a very different security order. I mean, economically, I think things are going to play out over time. Clearly, Europe as well, very quietly. It's been I don't think noticed sufficiently, but for example, the UK had already begun to make some overtures to China in the last 6 months. The British Foreign Secretary went to China, signaling that, maybe we're not going to be all in on the US rivalry with China, which also, again, begins to separate Europe from North America, from the United States. So I think it is, spheres of influence is a very good term to use. When you begin to push at it, you begin to say, okay, so what are going to be the contours of the sphere of influence? Because when you begin to think, for example, about Asia, what about Japan? Yes, we can think about China having a sphere of influence in Asia, but Japan has a long-standing relationship with the West, particularly the United States, that is economic, but also security. How does it fit into the sphere of influence discussion? Australia, how does it fit into the spheres of influence discussion? And the Middle East. There, I think it is interesting that despite the very close relationship with Israel that the United States has, there has been lots of discussion over the last year, even predating Trump, about the US's changing interest in the Middle East. So you have to think about those kind of adjacent regions and what that means for spheres of influence. But the signals coming out of the White House certainly are that mentality of dividing up the world into spheres of influence is one that they are attracted to.
Forgive me, listeners, as I pull the old switcheroo. I'm taking a break from our regularly scheduled Tell Us Health story from our longtime presenting sponsor to update you on an important development in the wholesale wireline internet saga we talked about most of last fall and early winter. Spoiler alert, it's good news for consumers. It looks like Minister Champagne and his team deserve a gentle pat on the back. I say that because there are real results from the government's efforts to bring down internet prices in Canada. According to StatsCan, since 2019, gigabit access has jumped from 61.1% to 83.1% of households. Household internet data usage has doubled, and real prices have dropped by 20%. These improvements are narrowing the digital divide across the country. The government's plan looks like it's working, with increased competition, especially in Ontario and Quebec, led by companies like TELUS, driving prices down even further. Clearly, there was an appetite for it. More than 250,000 people signed TELUS's Demand More Internet Choice petition, asking for more choice and competition. Specifically, and again, these are Stats Can figures, consumers who signed up for a high-speed internet plan in January 2025 paid 2.3% less than the same month in 2024. And in Ontario, where TELUS entered the market, it was 10% less. So time to give credit where credit is due. In what is adding up to be the most challenging economic context in perhaps, well, ever. Since we left off on wholesale wireline the first week of January, Canada-US trade relations have taken a highly publicized turn, and interprovincial trade barrier policies and overall economic issues are right at the forefront. Let's hope the government can have similar success, because those files require the same fervor as bringing down internet prices, and couldn't we all use a little more good cost of living news right about now? Back to TELUS Health next week, but to learn more about high-speed internet competition and wholesale access, visit telus.com/demand more internet choice. I think when you and I last spoke, we probably spent some time talking about how the West was going to fight China and how the West was going to, prevent Chinese influence from completely dominating, and what that meant in terms of alliances in places like Africa, et cetera, and it was all about the West as a construct versus China as a construct. How did that change? Why is that no longer the primary driver?
I think for the most part, it is as a result of the changing nature of U.S. leadership, which, I think we need to stand back and recognize that that was already happening and that there has been a slow adjustment to that. But now we flipped, right? It's been an actual pivot with this indifference. And so the West itself is fracturing in a very, very significant way. And, I think when we look at the relationship with China, I think we see the two ways in which this administration, the Trump administration, is operating. There's been a lot of discussion about how Trump is transactional, right? That is his MO. I'm not sure that that's always the case. He is transactional with those powers and those leaders who are close to as powerful as the United States is, or as he is. So I think we will see, we're not focused yet in the media and in current discussion about the U.S. approach to China. We will see transactional relationships and dynamics there. But with those who are weaker, it is not transactional. It is, the word predatory has been used, completely coercive. And that is true within the West, right? And so the West wasn't just a thing, a bloc. It was also a grouping of states that interacted in a very particular way. Allies, not necessarily a grouping of states that let the real configuration of power, the real asymmetry of power, play itself out fully, right? It wasn't a grouping of states in which this raw coercion was always exercised. Now, we can think of examples of where it was, and Europeans will say, we were leaned on pretty hard at different times over the war in Iraq, but not in the way that we are seeing it now. And so that fosters a level of mistrust, of fear, frankly, in countries like Denmark, Canada, and others. So I do think that grouping, which is partly geographical, it's also one that is cultural in a way. But it also is based on, years of transactions. It's historical. And, if there's one thing we can say about Donald Trump is that, he does not have a very keen appreciation for history and historical ties.
But maybe I understand history, or did understand history, wrong, Jennifer, because I've always been aware all my life, as I'm sure you have, that our existence, Canada's existence, as it is, was due to the benevolence of the United States, that in previous eras of world history, it's unlikely that there would have been a state like Canada sitting next to the United States. It would have been absorbed. It would have been a chattel state, or at best, of the United States. And they took a different approach. And I guess more and more I'm thinking whether post-45 is not the new normal, but a blip in history, and that we're reverting back to the actual norms of history.
Yes, I think it's a good point that it's a long period of history, so it's a long blip. It's a period of really dense institutions, right? Institutionalization, compared to other moments in history, where you also had a United States that was not only willing to help create new rules that, let's face it, favored it. Just as an aside, one of the things that drives me crazy is the refrain of the Trump administration that, the WTO and the World Trading System has ripped off the United States. They were a massive beneficiary for decades and decades. But it was also that the U.S. was willing to underwrite it and to use a combination of its power, but also of its hard power, but also what Joe and I called its soft power to sustain it.
Yeah.
And so while spheres of influence is one way to think about this, going back to history, the other is to look at the 19th century, right? To look at the early 19th century, where we had a concert of great powers who, used to carve up the world, territories of the world like cheeses, right? We'll take this, where you had a little bit of institutionalization, but it was a set of large powers at different points, 4 powers at different points, 5 powers, who were very much an elite group of states. There was a very clear hierarchy, and there's a phrase that is in the UN Charter that is very important to a number of states in the global South. The phrase is sovereign equality, right? Even if we know, in fact, states are not physically, materially equal, in the framework of the UN Charter, they are legally equal. They are sovereign equals. Everybody has a seat in the GA. And if you look back at the early 19th century, it is clear that sovereign equality was not a dominating principle at that time. There was stratification in the international system. And so I'm thinking a lot about now, not so much, a lot of people talk about the 1920s, 1930s with respect to, to fascism and authoritarianism. But when I'm thinking about world orders, I start to think about the early 19th century. Because certainly, for example, the idea that you would sit down during a conflict with another great power, but not have the smaller power at the table, that's very early 19th century to me.
Right. How much of this is driven by the decline of the United States in relative size and importance?
I think a great deal of it is. And if we had been having this conversation with a Kamala Harris presidency and not a Trump presidency, I would have said to you that the distribution of power globally has been shifting for the last 3 decades, and that the capacity of the United States to dominate has been declining for some time, right? So there's a baseline of this that we would have seen anyway, right? With the clear shift of material power to Asia, but also let's not forget to the attitudes of states in the global south towards the United States. And this sense that there is, I've heard them referred to as, if you follow elections, so you kind of like this terminology, the swing states, right? The swing states, but not in the sense of the US swing states, but the states who can kind of are trying to hedge their bets in the competition between the US and China. And what we need to realize is that a number of those, absolutely, India, South Africa, several in Latin America, several other states in Africa, that was happening pre a second Trump presidency. The capacity of the United States to have its way in global institutions. And interestingly, the ability of China, and I think this is really important, to portray itself as a guardian, as a believer in the rules-based system. When you hear Chinese diplomats, they are among the strongest in defending the United Nations Charter and the UN system, much more than Russia. Russia is much more a wrecking ball, right? Right. China is much more the supporter in the speeches of its officials, in the way that it interacts in the UN. So as the US withdraws from the UN system, China enters to fill that space. And I think it had been doing that for some time. And, it leads to questions like, why is it that some of the key senior positions in the UN Secretariat are held by those who come from Western states, from the US, France, Britain? China is beginning to take on those roles. I remember way back when Antonio Guterres was kind of running to be Secretary General, there was a conversation, why not have a Chinese national as the head of UN peacekeeping? Why not? They are allocating many troops to peacekeeping missions. Why not? So I think that sense that distribution of power has been changing, that's that baseline slow change we've been seeing. Now we layer on top of that a U.S. administration that is dramatically changing U.S. behavior on top of that kind of material change.
Right. So I read a great description the other day about why tariffs in the modern age don't work. It was from Eric Beinhocker, the Oxford economist. Basically, he says, it's because no modern industrialized country has the ability any longer to entirely produce one complex thing. Beinhocker says there aren't really even national economies anymore, at least in the sense that we used to think of them. Rather, he says there are international ecosystems that combine seamlessly to produce superb products, like the iPhone, which Apple says is the product of thousands of businesses in more than 50 countries, or microchips, or the vaccines like the one that blunted COVID so quickly, or a modern car loaded with technology and software. Beinhocker talks about a wire manufactured in the US, which is then sent to Mexico to be bundled with other wires to make a cable, which could then be sent to Canada for installation in the seat, for example, of a Lexus. The participation of different countries in the trade ecosystem, he argues, makes the car more affordable, safer, and better, and improves our quality of life. Imposing tariff barriers to disrupt the manufacturing chain does the exact opposite. Our sponsor, CN, is a crucial part of what Beinhocker is talking about. The railway enables our trade ecosystem, connecting manufacturers with each other and then with retailers and consumers. As I've said before, just about everything travels by rail. It's taken decades of trust and rules-based cooperation to get to this level of sophistication and integration, and it works for the common good. CN is immensely proud of being part of that. Beinhocker states that if your country is not part of the modern integrated flow of goods, expertise, capital, and people, then your country will not thrive. Your country will be poorer. CN agrees. Smooth, unhindered trade lifts us all. A trade war impoverishes us all. It's that simple. Tell me where Russia fits into this. Why does anybody give a shit about Russia? Like, they're not a big country militarily, as we can see from their struggles with Ukraine. They're a small economy. Why suddenly in Trump's world are they important?
Well, I think I can answer your most immediate question and then we can talk about Russia. So the most immediate question of why they matter in Trump's world is twofold, right? One is he admires strong men. He wants to deal with others who he perceives to be strong and powerful like himself. And he perceives Putin to be an equivalent strongman. So that's one reason. The other is, and we need to remember Trump's first presidency, Trump wants this war to end. He wants it to be finished. And just like he wanted the war in Afghanistan to be finished, right? So if anybody wants to look at how Trump negotiates, they should be looking back to his negotiation with the Taliban in 2020, when he sat down with the Taliban, did not include the Afghan government, made promises to withdraw U.S. troops, and asked for some things in return from the Taliban, which they never fulfilled. And that led the way for the situation that Joe Biden inherited, right? Because Trump wanted to get out of Afghanistan. And so that's the second reason why Russia's important. There's a major war going on that he perceives to be draining U.S. resources. He wants it to end. So that's why he's engaging with Russia. If we step back and look at why does Russia matter in a broader sense, you're absolutely right that demographically, economically, it is not a rising power, although it is desperate to have its status recognized. And that's why sitting down with the Russians without getting anything in return was such a strategic mistake, because what Russia wants is its status to be recognized. It knows that some of these material factors make it, in fact, much weaker. So that's absolutely true. But it has extended its influence in very smart ways. So if you think about Russia, it inserted itself in the Syrian war in 2014. It changed the trajectory of that conflict. It has inserted itself into situations in Africa through its mercenaries, but also through its diplomacy. It is very active diplomatically in Latin America. If you look at how Latin American countries fall on the Ukraine war, they're much more ambivalent than we would like them to be. And that is because of the very smart diplomacy of Russia. And it floods these countries with Russian diplomats to have its narrative dominate. So,
but not accompanied by money, is it? They don't have any money to give to Latin America.
Much less. Yes, absolutely much less. But they can offer them a form of security through the Wagner Group and others, right? They can help them solve their security challenges. So if you go, for example, I'll tell you, this is a very obscure anecdote, but I think it's really telling. If you go to the Central African Republic, where there has been a UN peace operation, there is a statue in the Central African Republic thanking the Wagner mercenary group, right? Oh. Essentially, it's a statue that embodies what Russian mercenaries have done to protect citizens and deliver security. But what Trump has done through his actions, I think, is to elevate Russia's power in the last several weeks. I guess the final thing I would say, and your listeners, you and your listeners may not see this as important, but it still has a seat on the UN Security Council. And that's what gives it disruptive influence still. But I think that fact is becoming much less significant as we move forward.
Right. So what does this all mean for Europe? How is Europe going to reorganize itself? What's going to change in Europe? Are they actually going to start spending 6-7% of their GDP on defense? Are they going to prepare to defend Europe on their own? Are they going to prepare to defend more than just Europe on their own? Are they going to admit Ukraine into their club and call that part of Europe and defend that? Like what do you think they're going to do there?
Well, there's a couple of signs of what is going to happen. There have been strong signals from the EU that Ukrainian membership in the EU is a priority. And I think, depending on what happens with the leadership in Ukraine, if peace negotiations do start, I think that is something that they will do. I think you will see, and it's very ironic after Brexit, I think you will see under this UK government, and remember, we now have a UK government that comparatively looks to be among the most stable in Europe, right? It will become much more engaged in discussions about European security. Remember, the UK has nuclear weapons, has a very significant military. So I think you will see, and you already are seeing, the UK reaching out to other European countries to talk about what are we going to do on defense and security. So the UK is going to become part of Europe again in that sense. I think they will start to increase their defense spending. How they do it and how quickly they do it, I think, is something to watch. But let's remember, the Scandinavian countries have already done it really dramatically. Countries like Denmark, Sweden, and others. And, some of the casualties of this have been really interesting to watch. So, and this is a discussion for Canada, right? So Keir Starmer announced an increase in defense spending to 2.5%, which was accompanied by a really significant decrease in spending on foreign aid and international assistance. That's been happening in Scandinavian countries as well, even prior to the Trump presidency. They were some of the biggest players in international assistance and foreign aid. So they're recalibrating their budgets. I think that's something that you will see.
That sounds like a retrenchment.
A retrenchment into
we're going to invest in defending ourselves, and we're going to spend less in our advocacy around the world to enhance our status, enhance our influence through foreign aid. I mean, foreign aid was never just charity, right? It was always a tool of foreign policy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's retrenchment in one sense. You're right. I mean, I think this is the moment that we are in with what has happened with USAID and what will have to happen in European countries as they recalibrate, is a discussion about what is the purpose of international assistance. What are we actually trying to achieve? I think you can, through diplomacy and smart diplomacy and different kinds of partnerships with countries in other parts of the world, not necessarily completely retreat. But it might not be through the tools of foreign aid, or if it is through the tools of foreign aid, that will be massively reconfigured in terms of how it's done, and it'll be very selective, right? There will be areas of the world, countries of the world that will be seen to be real pivot places for Europe, because it's still, at the end of the day, it still has the challenges that it's always had in terms of North Africa, in terms of migration, in terms of instability on its frontiers.
This feels like a massive opportunity for China, because diplomacy is one thing, but the Chinese show up with cash, right?
Yes.
I mean, they bought Africa. I don't mean to be crude, but they didn't persuade Africa of the merits of Xiism. They built infrastructure for those countries. Right?
Yes, they have.
And they moved in places where the World Bank wouldn't go, and other international lenders wouldn't help these countries. The Chinese didn't have questions; they had cash.
Yeah, and I think we will see that's true. It's not true that they had no conditions.
No! I wasn't saying they didn't have conditions. Right?
But it's not true that they had no conditions. They had a very different approach. I do think that it is an opportunity for China. And potentially for some others as well. But I also think we need to recognize within that the degree to which that's already happened, right? The degree to which several Western countries, in their efforts to have influence, we're already losing ground. So it's an acceleration, I think, of that. But you're right that it is a massive opportunity for others to fill the void, not just in terms of development assistance, but political influence as well.
How are Germans going to feel about being a military power?
It's a great question.
That's been so anti their culture since 1945. But they're going to have to be one, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think some of the ground has been laid for this through Scholz's announcement earlier on at the start of the Ukraine war. There will have to be a big national conversation in Germany about what that means. But there have been moments where the Germans debated how their military forces should be used, right? Going way back to the Kosovo War, right? In 1999, there was a big debate about how involved Germany should be. And at that time, the refrain of the German foreign minister was, we're there because of no more Auschwitz, right? We're there because we are saving populations from ethnic cleansing. But for example, in other contexts, in the Libya War of 2011, the Germans were much more circumspect about their involvement. So I think there's going to be a much more profound discussion. And you're right to focus on it. What does it mean for us now as the most powerful economic state in the European Union to play a role in Europe's defense? And how they invest as Europe in defense capability, right? They've been so tied, the UK's nuclear deterrent needs the involvement of the United States to fully operate. One thing the French did, and I think this is interesting to reflect on, right?
Doc, don't tell me we're going to rely on the French.
No, but what I'm going to say is the French, way back under de Gaulle, the French had a view, we don't want to be reliant on the United States. We want to have an independent nuclear capability, right? I've heard a couple of commentators in Europe saying we all need to be Gaullists now, right? About how we think about our defense. And so I think how the Europeans spend that defense money, how it plays out in terms of the companies that are nurtured, the capabilities, how independent they are from U.S. involvement, because there's so much connection right now, right, between European capabilities and U.S. capabilities. And that's something they're obviously going to have a very hard look at.
Well, because they were all designed to work together.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Greetings, Canadian Political Pod listener. I'm your narrator, Gary, an artificial intelligence-generated voice. Exciting and serious sounding is what we typed in the AI voiceover input field. And boom, Gary exists. Hey, do you know what's not artificial? Not even one bit? The highly influential audiences air quotes media podcasts offer to its advertisers. And I say that with all the sincerity a machine learning data-optimized predictive network of interconnected neural nodes can muster. Whether your ad message is on Curse of Politics, the Herle Burly, Hotel Pacifico, or the brand new Race to Replace, you will be reaching cabinet ministers, members of parliament, the political class, the C-suite, and corporate Canada, leading journalists, and tens of thousands of engaged Canadians. People saying this is a unique political moment is underselling it. Policy is under scrutiny. A party leader is being voted on. The Ontario election is underway. There will be a new prime minister. And then there's the guy living in the White House who calls us the 51st state. Does anyone remember another time like this? I'm instantly scouring millions of data points to answer my own rhetorical question. No, you do not. This is when you need to get your message to the decision makers. Email us at contact@airquotesmedia.com. You'll be dealing with Jill and Todd, who are real, not artificial at all people, and generally very friendly. Well, Jill is anyway. We're still deciding about Todd.
Okay, so where's Canada in all this, Jennifer? I mean, if we feel suddenly very fragile, I mean, Are our allies the Europeans? Is that even possible? I mean, they're on the other side of the ocean. We're right next to the United States. Um, like, what is Canada's position in this world that you're describing?
It's a very difficult position, right? Because we are among those who have been signaled by the Trump administration as of interest in terms of our territory and resources. So compared to the Panama Canal, compared to Greenland,
Right.
we are so interwoven, not just economically, but also people to people ties, right? So there are so many connections that we have fostered deliberately and that have naturally occurred over the last century. So we are in a position where we do need to think about who our friends are, who our allies are. I think it's really difficult for some of these European leaders or they perceive it to be difficult to stand up for Canada. I think we have to be.
Why stop? Why is that? Like, I'm hurt by that. I'm hurt
Yes,
by that I feel so alone, right? That nobody will stand up and say, that's a sovereign country and our allies. Shut your pie hole. Like, even the goddamn King of Canada, not that it would matter, but where the fuck is he? I mean, anybody. Right?
Yeah, and you're right. I think we need to be pressing our case that, and thankfully, I think the German Chancellor has done something to help us, right? So I think initially there could have been an assessment by the Europeans, well, this is going to happen in some places where the pressure is going to be really coercive. But, we may be able to do some deals. We may be able to isolate ourselves. I think there's a recognition now that that may not be the case, right? So that Trump's indifference stretches pretty hard, that Trump's adversarial approach stretches very far. And so I think we should be calling on some of our allies. Both Keir Starmer is in Washington today. Emmanuel Macron was in Washington earlier this week. So we have to think about those allies. But I think Canada needs some new partners. And maybe the word isn't even allies yet, because in this new world that you and I are talking about, the historic relationships, the long-standing friendships aren't sufficient and are changing. So we might want to use the word partners instead. Who are our collaborators? We have not looked in Canada south nearly enough, right? To Mexico, to Latin America. They are countries that share our hemisphere. We have wanted to ring fence the Canada-US relationship and say, oh my God, the Mexicans, their fentanyl, much bigger problem. Their immigration, much bigger problem. Don't lump us in the same bucket. Yes, factually true, but the reality is that the United States has lumped us in the same bucket. And so I think that needs to urgently change the way in which we engage with Mexico, with states in Latin America, particularly if we're thinking about trade diversification, which, our politicians are talking about. But let's be honest here. Diversification is not going to happen overnight. It is very, very difficult. And
70% of our exports go to the United States.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not as if we can instantly, send some of these exports to Cambodia or South Korea.
What will they do with Magna's auto parts?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is absolutely, and, I don't want to be smug, but in that 2004 book that you talked about, that I wrote, I did talk about Canada needing to think about diversification. And at that time, I was dismissed as a Trudeau era third option person, right? If you talked that way, that's how you were characterized. And we're now in a moment where we do have to take that much more seriously. I believe we will, but we cannot as Canadians think this is a silver bullet, especially for small and medium-sized businesses, right? This is going to be extremely difficult. Just like some of our trade with, when we were having this conversation about China, and whether we need to move away from China because it was becoming more predatory itself. So I think it is going to be very difficult in the short run for us to diversify, but we have to start. We do have to work with our European allies on questions of security. But at the end of the day, we are part of NORAD with the United States. They want to have a conversation with us about our Arctic. They want us to do more in our Arctic. So we have to get our own house in order.
Are they going to have a conversation with us, or are they going to have a conversation with the Chinese or the Russians and not even include us?
Well, I've heard your last guest, Andrew Coyne, I've heard him talk about that we are sandwiched between the U.S. and Russia with respect to the Arctic. I don't know the answer to that, whether they will engage.
But we can't assume that we're players
Absolutely.
in that conversation.
The days of assuming that are over. So we have to be very proactive in coming to the Americans with our plan to secure the Arctic, what we mean by that, what we're willing to invest. And again, this conversation was starting, but it wasn't nearly advanced enough. No, you're quite right. I think, the bottom line here is we can't assume anything. And that is what is really destabilizing.
So one of our tools over the years has been multilateral institutions. And we were fortunate to be included in almost all the ones that matter. So what do you think is the future of the core institutions, the G7, the G20, the UN, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF? It feels like all of these things are going to be evolving pretty rapidly.
Yes, I mean, when you
NATO.
talk, all of them. And, prior to Trump being elected, I think there was a sense that Canada faced a choice if it wanted to continue to see itself as a multilateralist. And remember, this isn't necessarily something discretionary for Canada. When you are less powerful, when you have 1.3% of the world's economy, when you have 0.5% of its population, you have a vested interest. This is not idealism. You have a vested interest in a system of rules that ensure that the powerful cannot continue to just whack others coercively. I
learned this at St. Matthew's Jennifer,
in the playground.
It's exactly. I would do anything to cling desperately to the perimeter of the in-peer group,
Yeah. So we had an interest in that system. It wasn't just starry-eyed, we like rules because they're good. It was also because we like rules because they are the best way to advance our interests. And even before the Trump presidency, we had a choice about whether we were going to be a system maintainer or a system innovator. And by that, I mean, were we going to continue to invest predominantly in traditional institutions that were already creaking, that were already losing their legitimacy? Or were we going to be thinking about new groupings, new partnerships, new sets of rules that might help to advance our interests better? So now that conversation, I think, is on steroids. If we look at U.S. behavior thus far, it has withdrawn from the WHO. It's withdrawn from the UN Human Rights Council. These are not surprises. I think they were, even under Biden, it used to be said the U.S. is back. The U.S. wasn't really back. It wasn't investing in these organizations. I think what is more, you can kind of think about a core and a periphery. What is more troubling, I think, for Canada is the U.S. in the G7 and the U.S. in NATO. I'll come back to the UN in a minute because I don't want to forget about it in this conversation. But I do think you will see, I was at an event with Jagmeet Singh yesterday where he said, we should not invite Donald Trump to the G7 summit. I don't think that's the approach we're going to see our fellow G7 members take. I think the U.S. has to still be part of these G7 conversations, has to be at the summit. But it is now a question of how does the G7 function in a way where different states with different relationships with the U.S. can begin to try to break through and help them see the costs of some of their actions. NATO, I'm less sure. I really am less sure, David, that it survives, because the moment that you have a NATO member subject to attack and you have no response, or the moment that you have the United States indicate that it would not act, I think that alliance fractures. So I think there we need to be thinking about what is a different set, maybe not under a treaty, but what is a different set of security relationships that we might be able to put together among a different set of partners. And I'm sure that the Europeans are thinking about this as well.
What you've got right now, if Putin invaded another country that's a NATO country, would NATO respond? And would the United States be part of that?
I think members of NATO would want to mount a response, but depending on the country it was, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Well, that's the end of the treaty. What you've just said is the end of the treaty.
Yeah. Yeah. Now,
because everybody has to completely believe that, or the whole thing doesn't work.
Yeah. It's built on credibility. With this president, I'm not sure.
Right.
And so that, I think, is the context in which NATO is now operating. I think there will be a lot of discussion with the U.S. administration about the importance of NATO vis-a-vis Russia. I mean, remember, I think we need to step back here, that just the degree to which these overtures to Russia could backfire for the United States, right? So if you are Beijing, if you are other countries around the world and you are watching those discussions that happen between the United States and the Russians, I think you're thinking, this guy is weak, not this guy is strong. This guy is weak. He is willing to give away concessions, important concessions, before they've even been demanded. There's opportunities for us. So I think there is going to be an effort among NATO countries to really try to say to Trump, you need to recognize the power of NATO if we keep its credibility alive. But, the conversation we just had suggests that we can't assume that message will get through. Right. But let me come back to the UN.
Okay.
Because you would expect me to want to talk about the UN. I do think it is a really existential moment for that institution as well. And let's remember, it's an institution of many parts. And I used to, on programs like yours, make sure that I distinguished between the intergovernmental bodies, the Security Council, the GA, the Human Rights Council, and the agencies, UNHCR, right, UNICEF, others. But the cuts to USAID haven't just affected what the United States is doing on development assistance. The budgets of those agencies and their capacity to deliver humanitarian assistance have been absolutely upended. So the viability of a lot of what those UN agencies are doing has also been significantly affected. And I think it is a really existential moment for the organization. For example, practices like peacekeeping, although this could get interesting, right? Because if indeed there is a discussion around a peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Where are people going to turn? Putin has said no NATO troops as part of a peacekeeping force. We may turn to the UN. So the body that everyone thinks is creaking is also the body that we end up turning to because there's nothing else, right? So
I thought it was going to be the United States.
Security guarantees?
I thought it was going to be a United States security guarantee in exchange for. Can you just take a sidebar and just tell me what is Trump extorting from Ukraine right now?
Well, again, this is the point I wanted to make about transactional versus not. That was not a transaction. I want $500 billion worth of critical minerals, and the question then is why? Because I want them. It's a completely coercive move. It's not a deal. It's domination. So it is, from what I understand, it is an effort to extract access to a significant proportion of Ukraine's critical minerals, with also a joint system for development, like joint development with the US and Ukraine. And, listen, stepping back from this, some sort of Marshall Plan for Ukraine that involves partnerships with Western countries, this is not a crazy idea, but this is not the way to do it, right? There is a way to do this that might make sense. So Macron has said, based on his meeting in Washington, that it is with security guarantees. I didn't hear Trump say that. Not yet. Right? Let's wait and see. But if we play out a peace process and negotiations where there's an agreement at the end to have boots on the ground to monitor the peace, who's going to do it? There may be a discussion about UN peacekeeping.
So back to the UN. If you were going to constitute the Security Council right now, who would you put on it? What countries deserve to be on the Security Council right now?
So this is a question I ask my students every year. They have a project, make the case for who should be the new permanent five. I think there's a question about how you structure it overall, right? We've had a system where there's been 5 permanent members and then elected members, the E10. I am one of those who believes that a system of semi-permanent members would actually be extremely helpful, or it certainly from certain regions would always have a place on the Security Council. But I think there is a strong case to be made for India. But then you have questions about Pakistan, right? I think there is a strong case to be made for an African member. And I think there's a strong case to be made for a Latin American member. The hard part is Europe, right? Because Europe at the moment jealously guards its two, it has the UK and France.
Right.
If you were to do it from scratch, you would now say, well, the EU, are you the EU or not? It should be a UN member. Certainly it should be China. The question is about Russia. And I think, it's a bit of a thought exercise because you can't do this in the abstract. There are politics around this, right? And those dynamics always come into play when you start talking about the countries that I've mentioned. So if it's Latin America, who is it? Because you have these countries that vie for regional hegemony. Even in Africa, Nigeria or South Africa, or do you have an elected African member? But I do think if we're going to have a Security Council for the 21st century, you have to think in terms of where the distribution of power is in the world. So that's a nice thought exercise, but there are politics around how you would do it.
Right. Okay, let's wrap up with this. There's going to be a new government in Canada. What advice do you have for that government?
In general?
Yeah.
Well, Well, my advice falls into two parts. And the first is focused more internally, right? So, yes, this is a very frightening, destabilizing moment for Canada, but it also gives us an opportunity and a challenge at home to rebuild a national economy to the extent that we can, even though we are so dependent on international trade. So to really think about the trade barriers, of course, between provinces, but also the infrastructure that we need to have a national economy, the regulatory environment that we need to innovate in those areas where we have an advantage, but also to think about how do we connect ourselves again as people, right? To look at, is it the Council of the Federations? How are we going to, as Canadians, interact in this new world, right? With respect to our climate policy, I am a supporter of aggressive action on climate, but let's be very honest. It has been difficult to articulate a coherent national interest in that domain. We have to start to have the conversations, the interactions that build a very, very difficult consensus. Looking externally, we have to walk the talk. We have not been a credible player internationally in nearly enough ways. We have to communicate how we are going to increase our defense spending, how we are going to contribute to securing our Arctic, how we are going to interact with allies on issues of joint concern. And we have to make choices. We have to be very, very strategic about those initiatives that we push forward, given what we said at the beginning, that so much is changing. Does that mean that we can't talk about values? I don't believe that's the case. I believe if you listen to, again, coming back to Frederick Meertz, it wasn't just what he said about the US being indifferent. It's also what he said about Elon Musk and JD Vance interfering in the German election, undermining the democracy of an ally. And I think Europeans, with Canadians and other countries around the world, need to be talking about values of democracy, that we want to stand up for those. Whoever is undermining them. David, that interference in the German election was as profound as what he has said about defense spending, about Ukraine. This sense that we can't rely on the United States to be the champion of democracy globally. Those values we have to talk about ourselves, and Canada has friends and allies to be in that discussion. So that would be my advice. But there's many more elements, I think, to what we need to do, but we need to start there.
Musk appears to be going so crazy at such a rapid rate that I expect him within months to be wandering around the streets talking to himself and shouting at the clouds or something. Because, I mean, he just gets more bizarre every day. Like he was comments about the courts, whether or not there's a need for courts the other day.
There will be a course correction vis-a-vis Musk, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, there will have to be. Because Trump will begin to see that it's actually undermining what he wants to do. But let's also remember, as a final point, Trump is worried about time. He has said to himself, I've got 4 years to get done what I want to do, and probably 2. Right. He wants to move fast. We cannot sit around. The pace of this is not going to change. It's just going to keep at this level of intensity, and we've got to be ready.
Jennifer, thank you for this. I learned so much, as I always do, talking to you. I hope right now, in front of the audience, I can secure a commitment from you to come back regularly and explain this rapidly changing world to us.
I would love to do that. And I would love to make sure that when we do it, we also talk about some of those forgotten places that I think we should care about that we didn't talk about today.
Such as?
Sudan, the Congo, conflicts where nobody is paying attention,
Right.
and where I think we should be. I can tell you at another time I was in the Congo in late November, and it left me with a lot of impressions and ideas about how we have carved up the world right now, where we are indifferent, not just Donald Trump.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks so much for being here. And you look great, by the way.
Oh, so do you.
Ah.
You haven't aged a bit.
Yeah, right. Well, that would certainly explain
And I love
my
your
lack of...
Saskatchewan t-shirt. I love
Yes.
it.
Yeah. It's the railway map of the province. It's fascinating.
It's the railway map?
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I got to get me one of those.
Yeah, there's a great maker. There's a great merch maker out in Saskatoon that produces this stuff. All right. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, all of you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened, and a very special thank you, of course, to my old friend, Jennifer Welsh. We'll see you next week with more Herle Burly. Take care of yourselves. Till then. Bye.
Herle Burly, Herle Burly, Herle Burly.